Thank you, Whitney. And thank you, Rebecca. That was a great introduction to today's webinar. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Scott Oneto. As Whitney said, I'm a farm advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and I'm in the Sierra Nevada foothills. So I'm basically just east of Sacramento, working in the counties of El Dorado, Amador, Calaveras, and Tuolumne. And today I thought I'd share some research that I've been working on the last couple of years, looking at adding compost to rangelands and examining the potential benefits. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right into it. So you may be asking, why are we looking at compost? And so for any of you that are avid gardeners or horticulturists, or maybe you have a small farm, you know that the benefits of compost, right? So we know that it adds organic matter to the soil. It adds lots of essential nutrients. It helps buffer pH, increases water holding capacity, increases plant growth, all of these wonderful benefits. And so why don't we just think about more about adding this to annual rangelands? And so there's been a lot of work over the last decade looking at this concept. And so really one of the major drivers of adding compost to rangelands has been increasing soil carbon. And, you know, unless you've been in a cave for the last 20 or 30 years or so, you probably have heard about the increases in greenhouse gas emissions and the increase to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the idea of trying to sequester more carbon into not only plants, but also into soils where there's already this strong ability to sequester carbon. And so there's different ways that we can sequester carbon. And basically, that's just the concept of it is we want to capture CO2, carbon dioxide, and prevent it from going into the Earth's atmosphere. And I'm going to talk about this biological process of capturing carbon dioxide into plants, and doing that onto rangelands makes a lot of sense. If you look at total land area in across the globe, a big proportion, nearly a third of it is grasslands. And here in California, over 50% of California land area is actually considered grasslands. And we often think of woody biomass, big trees, conifers, being able to sequester carbon, which they do a really good job of. But there's been a lot of great research showing that grasslands are these huge carbon sinks as well. And if we look at California's massive landscapes of grasslands, it wouldn't take much. About 5% of if 5% of California grasslands were covered or dusted with compost, you can see that it would offset the greenhouse gas emissions from the entire agricultural community in California, and also all of forestry industries combined. And if we up that to 25%, so if 25% of California of the rangelands were treated, it would absorb 75% of all of California's greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of ability to sequester carbon on these ecosystems. And so, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of interest in this. And so I partnered with the local, our Amador Resource Conservation District, and several ranchers starting back in 2019 to really kind of look at this at a local level to get some localized data on examining what the potential benefits could be. And then also looking kind of past the carbon sequestration part, because that's been studied extensively by some of my colleagues, but really determine, is there some other things that might prove beneficial from adding compost to rangelands? And particularly for today's talk is what is the addition of compost on rangelands doing with some of our noxious weeds. And so I'm going to focus a lot of today's discussion on that. So just to give you a little bit of just background of the research project before I start showing you some of the data that we're gathering, I wanted to do this research on several different ranches, so we weren't just looking at one single spot. And so we chose 5 different ranches across Amador County, all on various different soil series. But we wanted to use similar grazing management strategies. So these are all cow-calf operations. And then I also chose sites that had lots of noxious weeds like Rebecca was just talking about. So I wanted really weedy sites, things with yellow star thistle on it, things with Medusa head, things with barb goat grass, because really the test was, would compost promote these weedy noxious weeds, or could we perhaps maybe shift the competitive advantage to some more desirable plants? And aside from that, without just the addition of compost, I also wanted to test, by adding these nutrients and all these benefits from compost, I wanted to see if we could shift from some of these invasive weeds by adding some desirable seeds. And so the treatments across these 5 different ranches basically consist of these 4 treatments that you see listed here. And so we have a no treatment, basically a control plot, so we could make sure we can test whether or not these treatments have any effects. And so really the first treatment in here was I just wanted to throw out some desirable seeds. So I chose a clover cover crop that I'll show you the mix here in a second. So on one of the treatments, we just scattered some seed mix. Another treatment, we added just compost. And then in the last treatment, we did the combination of compost with the seed. And so we wanted to see what would happen with all of these various treatments. And so this is just an example of what that the treatments look like over the landscape. This is one of the ranches of the 5. And so starting in the spring of 2019, went out and basically set up these different treatments. And as you can see, they're all numbered here, but so basically the red box illustrates those 4 treatments that I just mentioned, with the uncontrolled or the untreated control plot, the seed only, which is this green hashtags. We have the compost only, and then we have our compost and seed. And then you can see we actually replicate those treatments 3 different times across the landscape to look at those effects. And so this is what one of the ranches look like, and we have 4 other ranches that have a similar setup. And so this is myself out in 2019 setting up those trials, and then we did some initial soil sampling with tremendous help from our NRCS partners, looking at all of the soil parameters before we initiated the treatments. And so this is just some pictures of us doing that. And then in the summer of 2019, we started getting compost delivered to each of the sites. And so at each site, we got about 200 yards of compost delivered, and then began applying that compost in August and September of 2019, just before the fall rains started. And so this is just what some of the compost looks like out there on the rangelands. And then here's the spreading equipment. So I mentioned 200 cubic yards were delivered, and roughly the treatment rate was a 1/2 inch. So we basically wanted to put a 1/2 inch of compost across the landscape on those treated plots. And that roughly works out to be 67 cubic yards to the acre. This is what that treatment looks like. So this is one of the compost only treatments. So you can see there's just this fine dusting of compost across the landscape. And again, we timed it just before the fall rains. And then I mentioned we added, one of the treatments was included a seeding of clover cover crop. And so we basically just used a bin seeder broadcast, and this was the seed mix that we use. It's just a combination of roughly 5 different subclovers, rose clover, and a medic in there. So applied that at 20 pounds to the acre as a broadcast application. And remember, this went on 2 different treatments. So the seed only, and then also that combination with compost and seed. So looking at some of the data, so this just shows what the soil conditions look like prior to any of the treatments. And the different colored bars here represent the different ranches. So in the legend down here, you can see one of the ranches was named Curran. There's one called PT Ranch, one Del Ordo, one that's titled MLLT, and then one here called Brownlee. And so these just represent the different ranches and just some of the key soil parameters that we were looking at. So here we have pH. You can see all the soils were pretty much in the same pH, kind of slightly acidic, and organic matter, again, across all the ranches, roughly anywhere from about 1.6 to just over 3.5% organic matter. Nitrogen is fairly low in our soils here in the foothills. Also, phosphorus is fairly low in the foothills. And then we're also looking at some other parameters like water holding capacity, bulk density, those kinds of things. And so this was all the data before the trial. And so at the very end of the research project, we'll look at some of these parameters to see how they've changed. But basically, you can see all of the ranches had fairly similar soil conditions. So one of the things that we're measuring is forage productivity. And so forage productivity is the biomass, the amount of growth that the annual rangeland is growing on a season. And so we typically go out and measure this at what we call peak standing. So as it's transitioning from that green to starting to flower and set seed and then die, that's pretty much the peak biomass for forage production. And so we'll go out and measure that on on pounds per acre of biomass. And so to show you what kind of data we're getting, you would obviously again, working with compost, it increases typically plant growth. And so just from that, we would expect that in the compost treatments, we should see increased biomass. And so this first bar graph here that I'm going to show you is 2019. So this was prior to the treatments. And these are in the different individual plots prior to adding any of these. And so we just wanted to see what the baseline was in year one before we added the treatments. And so in 2019, as I was setting up the plots, you can see that across the board at all 5 ranches combined, we were producing about 3,000 pounds of forage to the acre. In 2020, we came back out and measured forage productivity. And in the control plot, you can see we were, roughly a little over 3,500 pounds. And then you look at the seed only treatment where we added that clover cover crop, not really a huge difference. I would say really no difference at all. So we threw a bunch of seed out there and it didn't really add any biomass. If we look at the addition of compost and compost only, you could see we produced 33% more biomass. So we're over close to 5,500 pounds per acre of forage. And then when we look at compost and seed, we were up 17% over the control. So definitely showing the benefits of compost in that year one. This last year, 2021, we came back and did the same thing. And it looks like one of the numbers shifted here, but you can see again in the control versus the seed, again, very similar, not really any difference, kind of basically the same sort of data trend that we saw the year before. So there was really no direct benefit in terms of making any more forage by just going out there and throwing out some seed. In the compost only treatment, again, we saw an increase above the control, 11%. And then in the compost and seed, it's actually more similar to the control. So we didn't really see that same increase that we saw the previous year in 2020. So so again, this is a very dynamic system, very dependent on precipitation, the weather patterns, the timing of that precipitation. And so we always see these sort of ups and downs of fluctuations in terms of total biomass. And so we're going to continue to watch these over the next couple of years to see whether or not that was just a 1 year increase like we saw in 2020, or if we'll continue to see that benefit of compost. So that's forage productivity. The other thing, of course, is we were looking at forage quality. And so that's just the nutritional value of that forage. And from the 1920, so in 2020, when we took the peak standing data and analyzed the forage, these are some of the different nutrient values that we were looking at. And I'm not going to go over all of these because there's not big differences, surprisingly, but there is one that we do have a tendency to focus on, which is crude protein, which is a really good indicator for quality of feed. And although these are all graphed on the same axis, and so it doesn't look like a big difference, but when you actually look at crude protein between the control, which is the bar on the far left, to the orange bar, which is the compost and seed, we actually saw a 32% increase in crude protein in that treatment. And so that was in 2020. Then in 2021, again, same graph, just the following year, we saw a 28% increase in crude protein. So makes sense. It's making more in the compost and seed treatment. We know clover tends to have more nutritional value than, of course, grasses. And of course, the compost is adding all of those nutrients for more biomass. So we saw more biomass and we saw more nutritious feed out on the landscape. But this is where I wanted to spend the last bit of the time I have, is looking at plant diversity. So, how are individual plant species responding to these treatments, especially when it comes to some of these noxious weeds like Medusa head, Barbary goat grass, yellow star thistle? By adding compost, are we just giving them more nutrients so they can grow bigger, make more flowers, make more seeds, and end up becoming more problematic? Or can we actually shift the dynamics of this system so that we potentially give the competitive advantage to the more desirable plants like ryegrass or blando brome or fillery? And so this particular slide, I apologize, it's so busy, but this is all of the plants across the landscape, across all 5 ranches, and what their response is to these different treatments. And I grouped them based on sort of the type of plant they are. And so if you look here on this, the far left of the screen here, you'll notice all of these plant species, starting at baby blue eyes, going all the way down here to wild geranium. And I put that labeled them as a B. So these are our broadleaf plants that occur in the annual rangelands. And so I grouped these all as Bs, as broadleaf plants. And within each one of these, you can see that there are 4 bars, and each of these bars represent whatever the treatment was. So with gray always representing the control or the untreated, the blue being the compost, the yellow bar being the seed only, and then the orange bar being the compost and seed. And so I'm just going to pick on a couple of different plants here, just so you can see what some of the trends that we're looking at here. And so I'm going to pick out fillery as one of the broadleaf plants, because this is a very highly desired broadleaf, often in rangelands, because it is very high in protein. And you can see that it really didn't have any significant change across across the different treatments. And so between the control and the compost and seed, there was a slight increase, but not significantly different. And so we'll go to the next group here, which I have listed as the Gs. So these are the grasses. And these are, I would say, the desirable grasses. These are, the grasses that are often looked at as a positive for forage value. And there's really no significant changes across those 4 treatments in this particular year. Moving over to the third category here, this is the S's. These are the seeds. So these are all of the different clover species that were observed in all of the treatments across all 5 ranches. And the one thing that I'll point out are some of these just went significantly higher. So I'll pick on rose clover here for a second. You can see in the untreated or the control, this gray bar, were less than 6% cover. And you go up to the seeded with the compost, this orange bar up here, and we are up over 16%. So certainly a very significant increase in the amount of rose clover in that one particular species. And then we focus here on this last category here, which is the weeds. So these are the noxious weeds that I was really wanting to see what their response was. And the ones that were, of course, that I'd mentioned before that we're interested is barbed goatgrass, through foxtail in here, ripgut brome, medusa head, and yellow star thistle. And you can see with barbed goatgrass in the control plots, we have significantly more barbed goatgrass than if you go down here to the compost and seed. We saw a great reduction in the amount of barbed goatgrass when you added that actual seed. You saw it's just sort of this trend where you saw a little bit less in the compost only. You see even more less barbed goatgrass in the seed only. And then when you add the compost and seed, that's where you saw the greatest benefit. So saw that in barbed goatgrass. We also saw that similar trend in medusa head. So just to kind of wrap all of those things up to make it a little bit easier to digest, I put all of those weeds into those different plant types that I just talked about. So all of the broadleaf plants are all condensed into this slide here, with this grouping on the far left showing the broadleafs and what their response is according to these different treatments, the grasses, what their response is, the clovers, and the weeds. And so looking at this slide, the broadleafs, they really didn't seem to do much different when you're looking at all of the broadleafs combined across all 5 ranches. Grasses, also a little bit of fluctuation here and there, but not anything crazy to point out here. It's with the clovers is where we really see this very interesting dynamic of how the addition of compost with seed, you see this great reduction or great increase in the amount of clovers on the landscape. So you can see the untreated here, which is right around 8% cover, going up over close to 30% cover when you have the combination of compost and seed. And then with weeds, we saw, again, putting all of those weeds, those noxious weeds into this last grouping here, you see a 30% reduction in noxious weeds with the addition of compost and seed. So that was in year 1. In year 2, we saw kind of similar trends in some of these things. Again, in the broadleaves, we saw this crazy increase in the number of just broadleaf species in the seed-only treatment. I think there would just happen to be a lot of broadleaf. There was tons of fillery in our plots last year. And so I think that's showing through in this particular slide. In grasses, we didn't see any major shifts. But then again, in clovers, we saw this again in the clover and compost treatment, this high increase in clover. And again, similar trend in the weed category. We saw 55% reduction in those noxious weeds. So I think this is some really interesting data that we're gathering. Again, it's only 2 years worth here, so we're going to continue to monitor these over time to see if we continue to see these trends and whether or not this one-time application of compost can provide this sort of long-term benefit across these larger landscapes. So I'm not sure if we have time for questions. If so, I'll check the chat pod. I just want to thank all of those that have been involved with the project. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Whitney.